Well, thanks everyone. Lovely to be with you today. And if you'd said that to me, say maybe 12 months, certainly 14 or 15 months ago, that I'd be standing here leading a seminar on neurodivergence and all about it, I would have been very surprised because I knew almost nothing about it. In fact, when kind of randomly we decided we'd do a workshop and focus on neurodivergence at the Centre for Christian Living event last May, and I started reading and researching. I knew Kate was interested in the topic. I decided I'd interviewed Kate, and I very quickly discovered not only that I hadn't thought biblically and theologically about this area very much at all, but that I also knew very little about what neurodivergence was or what the experience of neurodivergent people was like. And Kate was very kind to me. We had about 3 conversations or versions of our interview together because it took me a while to get up to speed. I just had a whole lot of cliches and kind of very basic understandings of and misunderstandings of what it meant to be neurodivergent and what that experience was like. And it's been, as they say, a bit of a journey for me to come to understand all those things and to apply what the Bible says to those things. And my main role in today's seminar will be to put some of the theological framing around our understanding of this issue and how we should respond to it, and how we should love our neighbours, our neurodivergent neighbours, our neurodivergent children in the light of the gospel. And a lot of the thinking that I've done and that we've done at the centre over the last 12 months on this topic, you'll be hearing some of the fruit of that today. But that's me. Over to you, Kate.
Yeah, for me, I think I started being interested in neurodivergence back when I was at uni. I studied gifted education, and giftedness is a type of neurodivergence. It's a different way of thinking. It's more than just being good at maths. It's a broad thing. And back then as well, we also kind of some of the things that are actually now understood to be aspects of autism. Back then we used to kind of lump in with giftedness if someone was gifted and autistic. And so adapting classrooms, adapting curriculums, that sort of thing was fascinating to me. And then when I had kids, we learnt along the way that a couple of them are neurodivergent, they're autistic. And so some of this stuff was really important for me to be thinking about. And I was pretty shocked when I asked friends of mine, can you give me all the Christian material on being a Christian family with neurodivergent kids, because it makes a big difference. And there isn't, well, at that stage there wasn't a whole lot. There's more and more, and it's really exciting to see more and more Christians speaking about it. So I'm currently studying a graduate certificate in autism and neurodivergent studies. And I've been writing and podcasting and a few other different things. And I spent a year researching as well with Anglican Deaconess Ministries, ADM, families and what it looks like to be a Christian family, and doing some research alongside that, how to support Christian families. So I'm really excited to be doing this topic today. Why don't we start actually by saying what neurodivergence is? So neuro, brain, divergence means different. So kind of brains that operate in a way that isn't what you'd expect the typical brain to operate like. But in saying that, we also need to say no 2 brains are the same. You're never going to find 2 neurotypical brains that are the same or 2 neurodivergent brains that are the same. It's just kind of a category in order for us to begin asking questions. So neurodivergence isn't the answer, it's the beginning of a lot of questions, I think, when you get to know someone who is neurodivergent. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll be tag teaming back and forward. We're going to start now by looking at some sort of theological framing. And then I'll hand back over to Kate and she'll talk about especially how that plays out in the family. Then we'll talk a bit more theological stuff about the nature of grace and church relationships, kind of bouncing a little bit off what we did this morning. And then back to Kate, who'll talk more about the practicalities of what it means to be a neurodivergent family as part of the family of God. And we've got a clicker. We've done 1. We're now on to number 2. And I'll hope to remember to click as I go along. What I'm going to do over the next 15 to 20 minutes, fairly quickly, is take you through the major kind of theological landing points that make up a map for us, I guess, to navigate our way into this topic. I'm going to move fairly quickly because most of these points are points which in themselves you'll be very familiar with. They won't be brand new points. God created the world, for example. That'll be the first one. One that you might be familiar with. You may not have put them together in quite this order and in quite this way, but I'm going to try and show you what these points are and how they fit together. There are 7 of them, and each one is just going to be expressed in a sentence, which is on your outline. and this is the first sentence, that the marvellous diversity of creation is contingent upon Yahweh, contingent upon God, who by his wisdom and spirit majestically created it, sustains it, rules it, delights in it, and judges it. We need to start with creation because, as Kate has just said, neurodivergence is about different brains, different aspects of the created order within us. And I put Psalm 104 down there as just one place that highlights the magnificent diversity of God's creation. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. How wonderful are your works, O Lord. Psalm 104. Here is the sea, verse 25. Great and wide, which teems with creatures innumerable, living things great and small. There go the ships, and Leviathan, which you formed a planet. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide your face, they're dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to the dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. Psalm 104, as you probably know, is this wonderful picture of the extraordinary lavish profusion and variety of God's creative purposes, and how much he is to be praised for his manifold works. The deep, the waters, the mountains, the valleys, the springs that gush forth, the birds, the wild donkeys, even the rock badgers, they're all there in Psalm 104. And man, of course, who cultivates and works in this creation. And all of this profusion of diversity is subsistent upon and contingent upon the great Yahweh, Lord, capital L-O-R-D, of this psalm. Not self-contained, not operating under their own necessity, but dependent on him for everything by his wisdom and his spirit, majestically created in all its variety and interlocking, interconnecting detail, which God delights in. The other key factor, in fact, in this psalm is the goodness of the Lord and the goodness that is expressed in his creation, and therefore the delight that the Lord and the psalmist, by implication, experiences as he looks at and appreciates and celebrates every aspect of this magnificent, interconnected creation. And this, of course, includes our brains, which are part of God's creation. And it includes, as Kate's already alluded to, the differences between us, the different details of our createdness in all their diversity. The goodness of being blonde or brunette or black-haired or red-haired. The difference of being tall or short or left-handed or right-handed. And the goodness of different brains, of the profusion of different capacities and abilities and strengths that we have in the human family. And as a matter of convention, as Kate said, we have decided as a community to label as neurodivergent, as different in a certain way, some brains which have very often particular ordinary strengths. That is, particular aspects of God's goodness that have been built into their created selves. The goodness of the neurodiverse brain, if I can put it that way, or the neurodivergent brain, is an important theological point to lay down. Very often when we think about neurodivergence in the past, it's almost been entirely under the frame of the fall, which we'll come to in a moment. That is entirely under the framework of problem and of disorder. However, it's important to recognise that neurodivergent people, nearly all neurodivergent people, experience certain strengths and abilities and capacities that the more typical kind of brain doesn't have. There's a variety of goodness within that neurodivergent brain, if I can put it that way, that needs to be delighted in and given thanks for. But there is that note also of sin and wickedness in this psalm. Let sinners be consumed, the final verse of the psalm says, let the wicked be no more. There is this discordant note in Psalm 104, just as there is a discordant note in all of the created order. And we see that too in Psalm 139. I'm going to glide over this one fairly quickly. This is a favourite psalm of many neurodivergent people. When we spoke with neurodivergent people leading up to our workshop, many of them, if they wanted to name their favourite Bible passage, it was this passage. The sense that God knows and creates each one of us intricately and wonderfully, knowing our faults and judging the wicked. Sorry, I'm forgetting to do the clicker and Simon's making up for me, but thank you, Simon. I'll try and remember. This, of course, is another creational psalm, Psalm 139. It's more about God's knowledge, his supreme omniscient attention to everything in his creation, and how the psalmist can't run from him. There's a hint in that the psalmist might want to run from him, perhaps, but he's insistent that God sees him everywhere. In fact, he saw him and knew him right from the very beginning, even down to the intricate way he was knitted together in his mother's womb. In those famous verses, fearfully and wonderfully made, how wonderful are your works. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. But interestingly, in this wonderful picture in Psalm 139 of God's knowledge of each and every person and the intricacy and intimacy of his creation of each person, which is so important for many neurodivergent people. God made me. He made me the way I am. He didn't make a mistake when he made me. The things that he put in me, the way my brain works, is part of his glorious creation and his knowledge of me. And yet, as in Psalm 104, this psalm too also has a kind of a grating of gears at the end when it turns to the destruction of the wicked. It's this beautiful psalm of God's knowledge, and in the end, oh, that you would slay the wicked, Lord. It's like a change of gears for us. And yet the shadow of sin and wickedness lurks in this psalm as well, the shadow of the fall, the shadow of the dysfunction from which we cannot hide and which God searches and knows. And so if I want to summarise, coming to point 3, I told you I was going to try and work quickly. There's point C. Oops, I'll go back one. A theologically framed neurodiversity describes the wondrous differences in human brains in all their created goodness and in all their fallen dysfunction. And we need to affirm both of these things. To receive with thanksgiving the goodness of the different divergent brains with their various abilities and strengths, and to lament and mourn over the fallenness of human brains, who each of us have our own dysfunction. And it's very important to emphasise this. All are different and diverse in our own way. All are fallen and dysfunctional in our own way. Just as there is diversity of goodness that must be celebrated, there's diversity of fallenness. And when we describe the neurodivergent brain, we're describing a brain that has unique good capacities very often, not in every case, but very often, and also unique fallen dysfunctions of different kinds. Because whatever label we give to ourselves, every one of us is both a magnificent creation of God's goodness and also a dysfunctional fallen creature, subject to decay and disease and disorder and death in the own individual ways that we experience. Now, there's a tendency in thinking about neurodivergence, both in Christian circles and without, to emphasise one side of this polarity over the other. To see only disability and disorder when we look at neurodivergence, or perhaps to see only positivity and diversity in need of affirmation. And neither really is adequate as a Christian theological vision or as a realistic vision of the neurodivergent experience. To see only disability and disorder fails to give thanks for the extraordinary gift of God in making each one of us the way we are, with unique strengths. To see only goodness and good creation is to live in a fantasy world that limits our compassion and understanding for the real problems and difficulties that neurodivergent people very frequently experience. And Christianity has unique resources for understanding this. We have a theological frame in creation and fall that helps us to say both things just as strongly and as powerfully. And without that theological anchor in creation and fall, our understanding of neurodiversity tends to drift either towards a more medicalised model or to a more political model of understanding the phenomenon. If you have just an empirical view of the world that sees physicality and matter as the only things that exist, then neurodivergence is a divergence from a norm, from a physical, medical, scientific, mathematically described norm that thus needs to be corrected and returned to in some way or compensated for. And the history of viewing neurodivergence only through that medical model as a divergence, as a dysfunction or disorder from the norm, has been very difficult for neurodivergent people and is inadequate on its own terms. On the other side, though, we've also seen over the past 30 years perhaps a swing in the opposite direction. If there is no such thing as a good creation, if value is something we create and ascribe to the things around us, then in the end all value is personal, and the values we ascribe to things are personal and political. People value things and call them good for their own purposes, to gain some advantage. And the origins of the word neurodiversity, in fact, it's a relatively recent word in our culture. It was coined in the 90s. An Australian woman, Judy the Singer, was credited with being the first person to coin this term. And she did so very much as part of a political movement. She was writing in the human rights and political sphere, in the identity politics movement, I guess we'd say. And she wanted to argue that the way we treated autistic people was just another way we treated a misunderstood and discriminated against minority, much as we would mistreat black people or gay people. That was the same category of political understanding, and that the so-called dysfunctions or disabilities of neurodivergence were really just a label powerful people put on neurodivergent people to marginalise them. Now, neurodivergence now is a much more widely used, less politically charged term perhaps than it was when it was first termed. But that aspect of neurodivergence and understanding of neurodivergence as a political phenomenon only, as an unfair discriminatory label only, is also inadequate in its own terms, even though it does name the experience and the marginalisation that neurodivergent people have often felt. I told you I'd move fairly quickly. I'm moving as quickly as I can because I want to get back to Kate. Point 5. Okay, so summarising, it's not just creation and the goodness. It's not all goodness. It's not all fall. It's creation and fall. That's all of us, and that's neurodivergent brains. But of course, in the Bible, there is also grace and redemption. Jesus comes to heal the sick and the brokenhearted, and his kingdom is based on grace, not ability. This is very important theologically to understand and affirm as we think about the neurodivergent people we are, or who are in our midst. Jesus comes precisely for those who are weak and fallen spiritually and physically. And there are so many passages here that we could look at. There's this wonderful passage from Luke 7 that I've put there in your outlines. Whoops. This is why you shouldn't give me the clicker. I'm hopeless with clickers. When the disciples of John the Baptist come and ask whether Jesus is the one or whether they should look for another, and he says, in that hour, it says he healed many in verse 21 of many diseases and plagues and spirits, of many on whom were blind, he bestowed sight. And he answered them, "Go tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive the sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have the good news preached to them, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me." The kingdom Jesus brings is a kingdom of healing and grace. And in the Gospels, very often, sickness is pictured as it's almost like a picture of the weakness that all of us experience and by which we all need God's grace and the grace of the gospel. All the different ways in which we are fallen and sick, both spiritually and physically, are addressed in the gospel and its blessings, now and in eternity. Christianity is not a meritocracy. It's the opposite of that. It's built on a profound recognition of sin and need. And we don't often appreciate this and the uniqueness of this way of thinking, because in a graceless meritocracy, and that's the culture we live in now, in a graceless meritocracy, neurodivergent people tend either to be marginalised as less capable or valued only for their superpowers. Again, if you don't believe in creation and fall and redemption, if that's not how you see the world, then you're left with a power-based meritocracy as the main alternative option. And in a graceless meritocracy of this kind, neurodivergent people tend to suffer and have suffered terribly by being marginalised and minimised and mistreated to their great hurt. But interestingly, more recently, in an effort to correct this historic disadvantage and to affirm and be more positive, there's a kind of an alternative swing to the other direction. And a number of neurodivergent people mentioned this to us, that they sometimes feel that the extreme positivity towards neurodivergence that's sometimes played in the media doesn't actually describe their experience, which is actually full of hurt and difficulties and problems and disorders of all kinds. Grant McCaskill, one of the good books on this subject, Autism in the Church, Grant McCaskill, who is autistic himself, he puts it this way. He says, we can fall into the trap of ascribing value to autism only insofar as it confers unique abilities. So yes, we'll welcome your neurodivergence and the fact that you're really brilliant at maths, and that's why you're valuable, because you're brilliant at maths. But in only seeing neurodivergent people as valuable if they're useful and have a power, well, we neglect and misunderstand the value and power of the gospel and the grace that it offers and their value as people. And finally, for me, in the kingdom of grace, we learn the truth about ourselves and we're enabled to live a new life of faith, repentance, and joy. The gospel of Christianity and the power of the Spirit brings a transformation of mind and of heart, to see the world afresh as it really is, to understand each other and to understand people in the kind of theological way we've just been describing. It helps us to understand that we're all broken, decaying, weak, dysfunctional, ungodly sinners in need of redemption and justification. We're all God's glorious creation, each with different abilities and strengths to delight in. It means that we're humble about ourselves and thankful for who God makes us to be. It means that we praise him and we're confident in who we are in Christ. In redemption, we're awakened to a new life in the Spirit. It's not a life which has just a materialist view of our dysfunctions and problems. It's a view that leads to liberation and a power to change. As we spoke with neurodivergent people about this, it was very interesting. Sometimes their experience was that neurodivergence could sometimes almost be seen as a cover-all excuse for bad behaviour. That you might behave poorly, but that's okay, I'm neurodivergent, it was just my neurodivergence that was speaking. And while there's a powerful truth about that neurodivergent people in all their variety do have particular areas of struggle and areas of weakness, many of them said to us they didn't want the weaknesses and dysfunctions of their created and fallen selves to somehow be cover for an unwillingness to address sin and be repentant, like every other Christian who has weakness and dysfunction and bad habits in our lives. It's not a kind of neurological determinism, in other words, that my brain is a certain way, therefore my behaviour is always this way and cannot ever be blamed or improved. In fact, the glory of the gospel is that we're enabled to live a new life of faith, no matter what our particular dysfunction might be or our particular weakness. And we're able to repent and change by the power of the Spirit, not ever necessarily to always overcome our inherent weaknesses, but to become more like Jesus in the midst of them. Now, there's a very quick canter through 7 key kind of theological landing points for trying to understand and frame neurodivergence and for what we're about to talk about next, more practically. And miraculously, I finished this, Kate, with, could I do it in 18 minutes? I'm not sure I could. That's 2 minutes in each one and a bit more. We're just about there. And we have 1 minute for questions. Does anyone want to raise anything, just to clarify anything I've said, push back on anything I've said, inject something I've forgotten to say before we move on to our next section, which will be to talk about how this plays out in a neurodivergent household. But any quick comments or questions so far on any of this? Yes, Amy? I'll repeat the question for the sake of, how does it relate to the question of personality?
Yeah, so like in terms of, you were just talking about it not being an excuse for endorsing bad habits and sin and that sort of thing. Is there a crossover in terms of like things that we might consider to be
Yes, I think so. What I was trying to get at was that in our creative diversity and diverse fallenness, nearly all of us have dispositions and strengths and weaknesses that are almost part of the way we are. That some of us get angry more quickly than others, just by the way our brains seem to function. Um, and so there are different. Our bodily nature and the diversity of our bodily nature frames who we are as people and the various things we often struggle with or the things we routinely find difficult. If you take that analogy or that way of thinking and say, what if you're the kind of person who finds dealing with certain sensory things incredibly challenging, so that you get to a certain point where it's very hard to retain your equilibrium and kind of just relate in a normal way, you would say, well, that creates a real problem for, say, for being patient, for being kind, for being open and conversational with others. And that needs to be sort of borne in mind and taken into account in the way we think about ourselves. Just as you think about the way you might be wired, as we say, the way we might be in ourselves and how that influences our godliness and the things we have to work on. It's the same kind of analogy when our neurodivergent brains might push us in a certain direction and we have a particular set of problems to deal with. I hope that's a vaguely clear way of putting it. Yeah. Sarah? Yes. Sure. So what we mean by personality, psychologically speaking, the kind of traits that we have personality-wise, which you might describe in certain ways, it's not mapped onto neurodiversity neatly. Thank you. Thank you. Good. Very helpful. One more, Sam.
You mentioned 18 months ago you weren't thinking about this topic at all. Like, is there a history of thinking in this? Like, what is the Christian tradition done on this topic through the ages, or is this a new arena of thinking?
It is fairly new, I think, Sam, in the sense that we've always had a theology of sickness and of disorder and decay and death and so on. And it's not as if we haven't thought about the nature of the fallenness of the world and how that relates to creation and how it relates to new creation and how it relates to Christ's redemption. We've thought about all those things a lot. The thing I found, having had those thoughts in the past too, I hadn't thought about a particular phenomenon, a particular way people experience life, which is developmental. That is, it's not a disease, and yet it is part of both the difference of creation and the fallenness of creation in a particular fashion. I hadn't thought about it in that frame very much at all. And much of the theological work that's been done in this area is fairly recent in trying to come to terms with how you frame neurodivergence in relation to goodness and creation and also in relation to fall and redemption. It's a fairly recent topic in the great conversation for one reason or another. Is that because it's a more recent phenomenon? It's something we've identified and are talking about now that we didn't in the past and gave different names to in the past? That's possible. Well, that's my time. Kate, over to you.
All right, thanks, Jenny. All right, so you can see where we've been. We're going to head into looking a little bit at what life can be like at home, and particularly for Christian families who are wanting to bring glory to God, who are wanting to raise their children in the Lord, who have the same goals as any other Christian family, and yet some of these practical things might be a little bit different. So in order to kind of address this, we're actually going to take a little bit of a step back. So in order to look at what might be going on at home, I think it's really important to understand a little bit about what can be going on inside a person's body, particularly when they're outside of the home. So as we've said, everyone's different, but we're going to pull out a few categories of things that are commonly complicated or difficult or painful for people who are neurodivergent in order to kind of introduce some of these things so that you can be thinking through, but there are many more that we just can't touch on today. 90 minutes seems long, but there's a lot that it would be great to fit in. And so as we look at this, you have to just keep in mind, everyone is different. But one of the big common challenges for a person who's neurodivergent is often sensory processing differences. So often a sensitive sensory processing system, that means that lights can be more bothersome, sounds can be more bothersome, the sense of touch, taste, I mean, any sense you've got, it can be more sensitive to the environment. And sometimes this can mean it's wonderful for a person. Holding something really soft can bring deep and genuine comfort because they're sensitive to that softness. But in the same sense, sitting here under perhaps bright lights can bring great discomfort. And often part of this sensory processing is not being able to filter out that. So perhaps when you first walked in, you might have heard, say, the air conditioning, and now perhaps your brain has filtered it out. But I'm sure there'll be people who are sitting here right now who are still conscious of that air conditioner and haven't filtered it out. I asked an autistic man to explain to me a little bit about sensory sensitivities, and he used the example of a lecture theatre, which is perfect because that's where we find ourselves now. So he spoke about a particular lecture theatre he went to recently. He said, what I found is that the lecture room is not a great place to be in, not just because I don't like studying, but the lighting hurt my eyes. I could hear the air conditioner. I could hear the buzzing lights. I could hear every spark of the sound system. The chair was uncomfortable, the desk wasn't big enough for me to spread out, and all these factors made that room pretty uninviting for me. So not only does he not like studying, but he's also trying to process all of these things and work through that while he's sitting there. And so it's, for some people, so he's talked about the physical discomfort there, but for some people it'll actually bring, it'll bring queasiness. They can feel trapped as well by the triggers. For some, it'll trigger a sense of fear or anxiety as well. Having bright lights might be making a person anxious, not just uncomfortable. And so it's worth understanding that what might be neutral for one person might be quite difficult for another person. So outside of the home, a person might be processing and dealing with a lot of things that are challenging for them. There's also attention. So this is an important factor for a lot of neurodivergent people. Again, not everyone. This isn't a lack of thinking, but kind of too much thinking. The brain can often be firing in many, many different realms at once, or perhaps focusing on one thing without focusing on the thing that they wanted to focus on at the time. So I asked a woman with ADHD to explain to me attention for her. And she said, "My brain is like a radio. I just can't tune into the station I want. I can hear the sermon through crackling static, but other stations burst through and block me from hearing clearly enough to understand." Social anxiety is another one that's important to think through. So it's actually very common for people to be experiencing social anxiety. And when you think about church, so many social aspects of church, school, workplaces, going to the shops. I asked a woman she's autistic and ADHD to explain to me about her social anxiety. And she says this: "Engaging with other people is incredibly draining, and it often feels easier to go and hide in the toilets than to talk to people. And the sheer terror when the service leader asks everyone to turn to the person next to them to say hi. I just want the ground to swallow me whole during those moments." And you'll notice that I've used neurodivergent voices throughout. It's so important that we keep listening to how people are experiencing this and hearing it from them, what it feels like for them. I mean, there are so many more things that we could be looking at. So there can be communication differences that make life challenging, or that means that a person is needing to use tools or supports that means that they're operating in ways different to others. There can be speech differences with stutters or slowed down expression, or even speech can change over time. A person can speak quite fine in one situation and not be able to access speech in another situation. People can experience amplified emotions, which can be great, really excited and happy, but it can also be intense sadness, intense joy that blinds what's happening around them, debilitating fear, from things that other people might feel fairly mild about. There can also be writing and spelling challenges. So you can imagine being at school and it's time to write something down if you have a writing or spelling challenge, or movement differences, which can be related to neurodivergence, balance and coordination. So things like sport or walking or running, keeping up with other kids can be harder. Getting dressed, that's part of balance as well. There can be executive function differences as well. So it's the brain's ability to plan, to organise, to break down a task into those little steps so that you know how to get from A to the finish point. There's the sense of what's going on inside your body, interoception. Some people have a dulled sense of what's going on inside their body, which can mean that they are hungry, busting for the toilet, and really thirsty, with everything that comes along with this, jittery, maybe headachy, perhaps feeling grumpy, without noticing that this is what their body needs. And so those are a lot of things that could be on a person's plate. Some of those things, all of those things, a mix of those things could be on a person's plate. And you can imagine how exhausting some of these things will be, how it can affect a sense of self, how it can affect a person's confidence. And all of this is often masked. So by masking, I mean putting on a presentation of what you want people to see, as opposed to what's happening on the inside. So for some people, they're able to and choose to work really hard to copy other people, to hide their emotions on the inside, perhaps to suppress their reactions, to try really hard not to jump when the sound sparks or whatever it might be. And I hear from people that masking is absolutely exhausting. So on top of experiencing all those complications, there's exhaustion from this too. One woman explained to me, no one knows how hard I'm working to maintain the performance I need to put on in order to be at church. It's scary, it's draining, but I put on a convincing show so no one realises how much I'm struggling. And a young autistic girl explained it to me. She said that she masks all day at school so no one knows what's going on. But then she said, I go home and break down. I feel really sad and I don't want to go to school anymore. So it's just worth understanding that for some people, this is what is going on outside the home, and then they walk in home. And hopefully home is a recovery space. Home should be a place where you can let go and relax, where the nervous system can stop bracing. But this is when exhaustion can be really palpable for people. And so for a lot of parents of neurodivergent kids, we can see this in our kids when they just walk in, and this isn't the sort of tired that I'm going to feel at the end of today. I'm going to get home and I'm going to need a cup of tea and I'm probably going to need to sit down and I'm tired. But I've come to learn over time that neurodivergent exhaustion is something quite different. It's like a cocktail of types of exhaustion from so many different aspects of life that have run them down. A woman with ADHD explained for me some of the symptoms that she feels. She said, the sensations I experience when I'm exhausted are often palpitations, heat, tightness in my neck, head, jaw, arms, upper back, clenching my jaw, hands, knees, toes, heightened sensitivity to lights, sounds, tastes, smells, and textures, increased sensitivity to internal sensations, such as my bladder is full when it's actually not, and muscle tension, pain, and discomfort. So that's some of the physical stuff that a person might feel. There can also be emotions that come with this, a deep sadness, a deep anxiety, even a sense of guilt. People will feel an emotional burden as well along with this. So you can imagine as a parent, I want my kids to do their chores. I want them to do their homework. And there is just this balance that has to be happening, understanding some of what can be going on. One mother told me about what life is like for her daughter and what this exhaustion can feel like for her when she gets home. The mum says, at least once a week, she'll cry until late at night because she doesn't want to feel this way. And sometimes she says she even wishes she didn't have to live. And she's aged 11. This is very difficult for a mother to hear. So that's that mother's reflection. All of this pressure, all this exhaustion can lead to meltdowns. Now, we could do an entire session on meltdowns, but just to say really briefly, meltdowns aren't tantrums. We unfortunately see a kid in the shop saying, "Mum, I want the lollies." "No lollies, wah!" And people will say, "Oh, they're having a meltdown because they want lollies." That's a tantrum. A meltdown is a full explosion, a release of the pressure that's been building up for days and sometimes even weeks. So this isn't a momentary, "I want the lollies," and giving the child the lollies isn't going to solve it either. A meltdown, or the adults can experience them too. And so this is something that can be really impactful for families. For some, meltdowns will be quiet and in a ball and in a space. For others, it will be full body, full house implications. And that's something that you're unlikely to see if you're supporting a family with neurodivergent members. Often people who have meltdowns, this happens when they're able to be in a safe space in order to release the pressure in the car, in the home, or that sort of thing. So not all neurodivergent people experience this, but for families who do have people experiencing these, it can be quite impactful for the family. And so the family naturally adapts to people finding life so tricky like this. It's a hard world. People in the family will be feeling this deep exhaustion, and it's a wonderful, loving, godly thing to be able to have an environment that supports them and prepares them for another day in the future for heading out of the house. So this can be reducing triggers. In our house, we don't cook spicy food during the week because smells, some of my kids find smells sensitive, so spicy foods are for when kids aren't already overwhelmed. It can mean little things like that. It can mean schedules, lists, pictures of what's going to happen, labels on things. It often means taking things a lot slower. Preparation for difficult things. If a young child finds a bath really hard with all the sensitivities that might be happening there might be a time of regulation that the parents need to be involved in, active regulation, in order to prepare the body for this bombardment of sensations. And then afterwards, in order to help the body wind down, time, togetherness, hugs, squishes, whatever it might be, in order to help that body to regulate again. So often time passes quite quickly in a family with neurodivergent members where people allow each other to be involved in their lives and allow people to be involved in adapting and in helping people regulate. And so parents will often have busier lives than what you can see on the outside. So not just regulating and so on, sleep is often quite complicated for kids, and so it might mean more hands-on from the parents late into the night or during the night or from 4 a.m. in the morning. It might also mean being more hands-on during things like meals that are quite complicated or tricky for that child. If it's an adult in the family who has difficulties, then that adult might need to be really conscious at taking time out in order to balance what's going on. There could be a whole raft of therapies as well, which take time, OT, speech, physio, psychology, and so on, in order to support the child. And so as we're thinking about ministering to families, it's just really helpful to know some of what you might not see that might be going on. And then this can change month to month, year to year, hour to hour. And so support needs can also be changing. Let me see look, I'm doing the clicker thing too, Tony. It's probably the clicker's fault, it's not ours. But we hold fast to the same biblical hopes and truths, don't we? And so it can be complicated because a neurodivergent family with all these other things going on, it might not be the matter of looking at Christian, godly families around us and copy-pasting. Oh, when they had a 3-year-old, they did this with their 3-year-old. I'll do that as well. we've actually got the privilege, I think, of coming back to the Bible constantly and going, that's not going to work for my family. So what's the goal of that thing that family is doing? I'll come back to the Bible. I'll have a look. I'm going to extrapolate from there what it's going to look like for my family. A family with neurodivergent parents and neurodivergent kids told me, we've had to go back to the Bible and work out what God really asks of us as parents and what his heart is for our children. We can't just do things because that's what Christians do. We might not be able to do a lot of the typical things Christian families do to enjoy and express their love for Jesus, but we still love him just as much. We're desperately trying to work out how to glorify him in our families, and that necessarily means we need to do things very differently. You can see, can't you, how loving the children might look one way in one family and completely different in another family. And so this brings us to point C, because there really is a distinctive good, I think, for families who are working so hard. It's a blessing from God. All these adaptations that a family might make, these aren't just a way to kind of neutralise some of the hard things. I mean, it is to help with the hard things, but we can hope for so much more than just neutralising hard things. When families are putting in this much effort, when families are turning back to the Bible, when families are turning to each other and working to support each other, what a blessing for the whole family. Even when things remain hard, it's a huge blessing to turn to each other and be thinking, how can we be supporting each other, to be communicating. I think too, the intentional aspect of supporting each other is a huge blessing. I see that in our family. We need to think through, how do you regulate? What is a way that your body is going to go from tense and anxious down to relaxed? And so relaxing isn't just get home, plop on the couch and put the TV on. We're actually needing to constantly be really careful with how we're regulating. And I know not a lot of adults, neurotypical or neurodivergent, who need to learn this. How many adults just go home and binge watch or turn to junk food or any of these other things that aren't actually going to help? That they're a pause button. My kids are learning to be intentional with the time that they have to rest and work to bring their body down. And this is some of that responsibility I think that Tony touched on too. If a kid's grumpy, if an adult's grumpy, you don't just have the option of bottling in or let loose. You're neurodivergent, you can do what you want. That's not what we want to be saying. No, if you're grumpy, okay, you have a responsibility to the people around you to love them well. You have a responsibility to use your rest time to bring some of that tension down. And as you go through this grumpy and as you're bringing this tension down, we're going to love and we're going to support you. I think this is such a benefit for families to be doing all of this. It doesn't have to be neurodivergent families who do all of this, does it? But it's wonderful, isn't it, to see that when God gives us hard things, he often will also give us blessings along the way, even as we turn together to be looking to God, as we turn together in prayer, as we look back to God for his purposes. I just think it's a huge blessing. And not to minimise the hard either, but it's good to just pause and think through that as well. So I hope you can see what some of these families might have on their plate, and that a lot of what's going on isn't necessarily going to be seen on the outside. So as you're supporting these families, or if this is you, to be thinking through some of these changing needs that might be going on. And so we're going to have a look at pastoral care for these families, because pastoral care needs to be informed, it needs to be adapted, and so that is our next section. I'm going to move straight on to that, do you think, Tony? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll zip straight onto this next section, which is our final section. I'm going to give three briefish kind of biblical theological points here, and then Kate's going to tease out what that often looks like in practice in churches and for church families. And then we'll have a time of questions. And if we're on schedule, amazingly. If we keep going like this, we'll have 10 or 15 minutes at the end for you to ask all your questions. It's in the providence of God much of what I'm going to say now in this next short section really flows beautifully out of what Simon said this morning. I want to just make 3 theological points about the nature of churches as communities, as households, that undergird the way we think about neurodivergence in church and neurodivergent families. The first one is that in the community of Christ, we impartially accept and welcome one another as Christ has accepted and welcomed us. It flows out of the grace of the kingdom of God, because Jesus' kingdom is one of grace to sinners, and because his kingdom calls us into being siblings with one another, into a family, into sharing a father and being brothers and sisters. Then our relationship with each other is one of profound, gracious acceptance, welcoming, and meeting one another, encountering one another as grace-given, forgiven sinners. And to not make distinctions, therefore, or divisions amongst ourselves as the world does. There's a few places in which the New Testament discusses this, not with respect to the issue of neurodivergence, of course, but in a way that is analogous to and teaches us about how we should think about these different kinds of differences. Romans 14 and 15, the issue there is different convictions about food and drink, differences that might be differences in background between Jew and Gentile and religious upbringing, in which the language of weak and strong is used. Paul says that we who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbour for his good, to build him up, he says. Now, it's worth pointing out there are differences here in this passage than the issue we're talking about. It's not as if I'm saying in this case the neurodivergent are the weak and the rest of us are the strong. It's by no means as simple or straightforward as that. But the principle is the same. The weakness here doesn't refer to weakness of ability or capacity. But the principle is that superficial differences, differences that are not about righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit, the things that really matter in the kingdom of God, these are not to divide us. Rather, we should welcome one another as Christ has welcomed us, as it says there in verse 7 of Romans chapter 12. I think that might be 15, or is that 12? Have I got myself mixed up? It's either 12 or 15, or possibly both. There's a related point, of course, in the letter of James. Don't make distinctions amongst yourselves, says James. Have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? In James's case, the issue is wealth and status. And we could easily extend those kinds of distinctions to principles of colour or ethnicity or other characteristics by which we label people and then treat them differently or show favouritism to those who don't have those characteristics. In both passages, it's love for neighbour, it's love for brother and sister that sees and welcomes and builds up the neighbour, builds up the brother and sister, and is not diverted by non-essentials, by customs or characteristics that in the end don't matter. Now, there's an obvious application here to the way in which we welcome and love and put ourselves out as a Christian community for each other in all our differences and with all our struggles and strengths. To welcome and love neurodivergent people and neurodivergent families, not to see them as a nuisance or as an impediment to us getting on with our mission. Because, as Simon said this morning, in a sense, we are each other's mission. Our responsibility is to love one another as brothers and sisters. That's what God calls us to. They're the neighbour that God has sent us to love, the brother, the sister that God has sent us to love. And that leads us to a second point, that mutual watchfulness and burden sharing is essential to Christian community. The nature of our brotherly, sisterly, family, household of God relationship is not just one of acceptance and welcome, it's one of mutual responsibility. Bear one another's burdens and so also fulfill the law of Christ. It's profoundly important in this passage. It's the law of Christ, it's the way of Christ, it's the manner of life that Christ teaches and requires, that we love one another and bear the burdens of others as he bore our burden. Now, it is possible to lose this emphasis in our passion for growth and for mission. It's easy to come to see church and the church community mainly as a group of volunteers engaged in an outreach to the world, as a kind of mission society. And that is an aspect of who we are as a family. We're a family that has that mission. We are that. But we're not only that, we're also a family. We're also brothers and sisters who have a responsibility to bear one another's burdens, to profoundly accept and welcome one another, and to love one another in our own particular situations. We can't bring these two things into an intense competition, these two obligations, our obligations to one another as the household of God and to the lost all around us, that is, to the household of God that are scattered still in this world. Both of these are love of neighbour. But I think Simon was right to point us to Galatians 6:10 this morning. We should do good to all men, love all people, all neighbours, and especially those of the household of faith. And by loving and serving the neurodivergent people and families in our midst, by putting ourselves out for their benefit, by being aware of them and helping them, this just seems to me to be basic Christian brotherly love. Not an optional extra thing, not a new program. It just seems to be, to me, the essence of what it means to be a Christian community. Now, Kate, did you want to chip in there, Kate, at that point, or not? Or you might just do it afterwards, because there are particular burdens in terms of bearing one another's burdens. There are particular burdens that neurodivergent people and families bring, and Kate is more qualified to speak about those than me, and she's going to mention some of those. I'm going to make a third point, though, that Christ not only gives us one another as burden, and he does, we are all given to each other as burden in that sense, but also as gift. Christ gifts his body with a rich variety of people whose contributions should be employed for mutual advantage. And again, when we spoke with neurodivergent people leading up to our workshop, I'd say their favourite Old Testament passage was Psalm 139. Favourite New Testament passage was 1 Corinthians 12 and the diversity of the body. As it says in that, I'll just do a very brief snippet from that famous passage that you know well. Now, there are a variety of gifts, but the same Spirit, varieties of service, but the same Lord, varieties of activities, but it's the same God who empowers them all in every one. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. The picture of a diverse body and the essential contribution that each part of that body makes, regardless of whether we might regard those parts of the body as highly honourable or highly dishonourable, each part, even the less honoured part, is only deserving of even more honour, says Paul. So it's not just a question of accommodating, welcoming, serving neurodivergent people in our midst, but also realising that God has gifted our congregation with neurodivergent people, and that those people bring with them a gift to our congregation and a contribution to our life that is part of the strength and edification of the body that Christ empowers in all these different varieties of activities and service. The presence and the gifts that neurodivergent people bring a great richness to the life of a community. And speaking to neurodivergent people in the workshops we ran on this topic, it was not just a sense from them of being accepted, welcomed, and accommodated, as if they're a problem to be accommodated in the congregation, and that's how you think about their life. But I've seen that God gives us all to each other with quite unique strengths, and the presence of each particular person and who they are and what their discipleship is in Christ is a gift to every one of the rest of us as well. And Kate's going to now take this up a little bit and talk more practically about what it means for the household of God to accept, welcome, and include all of us in these different ways. Over to you again, Kate.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Yeah, it's great, isn't it, to have a look at what God's family, the household of God, is to be looking like. And part of what Tony was talking about supporting one another, bearing each other's burdens, working together, part of that is understanding some of what these families might be working through. And so we've talked about some of those things already. We've talked already about what the home life might look like. But we also want to be watchful, as Tony pointed out. We want to be thinking through other challenges that people might be facing, whether they're a neurodivergent person or a family with together with that person or people. And so it's worth just taking a moment to talk through some of the co-occurring conditions or additional challenges that a neurodivergent person might face. So actually, a neurodivergent person is more likely to have a whole range of medical conditions. They're more likely to experience mental health challenges. They're significantly more likely to experience traumatic events, sexual abuse, abuse, that sort of thing. They're more likely to have eating disorders, substance abuse, and they're much more likely to be navigating gender dysphoria. So as you're supporting a neurodivergent person, it's worth understanding that this might be a reality for them or something on the horizon. And if you're supporting families, of course, this might be something families are thinking through, working through, supporting someone through now or in the future. So we need to be watchful alongside these families. It's also worth saying too that marriages can really be under strain. So with more time being put into kids, more decisions to be made, decisions around therapy, decisions around discipline, decisions around dinners. I mean, the number of decisions and then the reflection that needs to come with that as well can mean that there's less time and energy for a couple to be putting into each other. Of course, as we've already looked at, marriages can really thrive here as well. It can lead the couple to talk more, to lean on each other more, to communicate their needs, to be the support for the other person, to be praying together, to keep turning to God. It can be a huge blessing, but the families are likely to also, even with those blessings, be under strain. And so it's worth understanding that that can be a reality. Also, if the couple, if they have a different neurotype, so it's called cross-neurotype marriages. So this could be one is neurotypical, one is neurodivergent. Or it could be one is autistic, one is ADHD. Or it could be undiagnosed conditions, but a reality that the brains are operating so differently to each other that communication styles are quite different, relaxing styles are quite different, decision-making styles are quite different. And this can also cause enormous strain for couples. So a bit later, I'm going to tell you about a podcast that I've been running, but our most recent episode was with a Christian counsellor who works with neurodivergent couples and cross-neurotype couples. And she thinks this is so important for people who are pastorally caring for families to understand. Because just like we looked at with families, it's really hard to just copy-paste other Christian families. It's the same with marriages if the couple operates quite differently to other people. It's very hard to copy-paste, and yet that's kind of the expectation that, that Mari, this counsellor, sees in the Christian community. So she says this. She says, we have a lot of representations of what marriage should look like through Christian books, through preaching, through a sense of what a neurotypical relationship will look like. And very often what I see is couples who are trying to be neurotypical in their relationship and feeling overwhelmed by the reality that their relationship doesn't look like that. No matter who these couples are, they all have the same goals. They all want to be glorifying God in their marriages. The biblical picture of marriage is for every couple, regardless of brain type. So we're not throwing that out the window. But Mari, I really encourage you to listen to the episode because she really is very helpful at explaining what it looks like when we're supporting couples who are operating quite differently, the listening that needs to be the beginning point, turning back to the Bible that is a really important aspect of that care, as it should be for any couple, and working with the couple to work out what does communication look like given who you are and how you operate, and what does decision-making look like? What does it look like when you're overwhelmed? What does it look like for you to need support? What does it look like when you're supposed to react to a comment from the other person? And working out that with the couple, understanding that neurodivergence can change how you apply what a Christian marriage can look like. So as we're walking along these families, in good times, in difficult times, and these times all change as well, as we look at supporting these families, so we want to be remembering that all of these complications are also things that are going to be important to think through about how families experience church as well. So we've looked at a lot of the different things. Now you can imagine a person walking into a church building with the people, the lights, the echoes, the sounds, the different chairs, the service outline might be different each week, all sorts of things. Families, when I've spoken to different families, this is one of the most challenging aspects for Christian families. And what a shame when we see how complicated life can be, how draining life can be. You know what they need? Christian community. And for some, it's so hard to get there. So here are some things that families told me. One said, I wish people knew the amount of energy it takes for us to just be at church. We can have meltdowns in our house from 6 a.m. And I've been told you just need to have higher expectations of him. And he needs to learn to behave himself. You can imagine how gut-wrenching that is if that's actually not the heart of the issue. Another family said, occasionally we've had a really, really hard morning before church, and my son is very dysregulated, and we've done well to get there at all. Any jokey comments on the time of our arrival hurt and make me want to cry, as no one knows what I went through to even get there that morning. One family told me that church has brought them a lot of grief. They said, there's so much grief here. Every Sunday we feel grieved. Church is so hard to be at for our family, and it's a loss we feel deeply. We'd love our church to be more accessible for members with different needs. And one family told me, church was very, very hard. We left our church a few years ago, and we just haven't been confident to find a new one. So you can probably think of families in your church who find church hard, but it's hard to think of the families who aren't there, who've never stepped foot in the church because they've already had years of hardship, because they're not confident to come, because they popped in one week and it was so hard and people so much didn't understand that the hurdles to get there are just too much. And so in order to be loving these families, I've come up with 4 C's to help us remember. We want to be curious. We want to be collaborative. We want to be creative. And we want to love like Christ. So to think about being curious, remember here, there's so much more going on probably than what you can see. So you want to be curious, asking and believing. So that mother who said we had meltdowns in the morning from 6 a.m., beginning at a place where you're believing that that is even possible, understanding that that's a reality for some. Rolling meltdowns for 4 hours is a reality for some people. And so beginning where you're asking what that's like, as opposed to, oh, for my kids, I just gave them a muesli bar and they were fine. Helping them work through this. So one mother really encourages us in this. She says, what you see on the surface, out in public, at school, at your home, is not what we see in our home. Our children mask a great deal. Their classroom teachers were all very surprised at the autism diagnosis for both our children. Just because someone looks like everyone else doesn't mean their brain or nervous system works in the same as everyone else's. Just because someone appears to be coping doesn't mean they are. And so perhaps families need to ask for a change of this or a change of that, and you look and that adult or that child actually seems to be coping just fine. So this is the curious. Tell me about that. Let me ask more questions about what that's like for you. And then what supports you need. So this brings us to being collaborative. So we want to work with the family, work with the child, work with the adult to figure out what they need. A family told me what worked well for them. They said, the staff team at our church spoke to us as if we were experts in our son, which we are. And they never spoke as if the things we asked for were burdensome or unhelpful. I felt seen because of the way they asked real questions with a heart for seeing him included. Notice they felt seen because of this interaction, this working together, listening, asking, being collaborative. She hasn't pointed to the end point. They didn't feel loved by the things that were done. The most important thing here is this attitude, this love, this collaboration, this curiosity. Of course, you might ask people what they need and they have no idea, or the family might be so exhausted that they're not ready to have this creativity to think through what they need to ask for from people at church. So if you have any spare energy to get to know what things work for neurodivergent people, or to read a little bit, listen to a great podcast that's out there, and get to know a little bit about what could work, you might have some ideas that you could work with the family to adapt and work out. And of course, collaborating with the child as well. So collaborating with children of all ability levels and ages, I think that it's easy to throw that out the door because it can be hard for some. But collaboration doesn't necessarily mean a verbal one-to-one, what do you need? I need this, let me advocate for myself. It can actually be watching this person, seeing what hurts, what they enjoy, asking the family how did they react when they got home, and working out, okay, I'm going to collaborate with this child, I'm going to work out how can I incorporate some of these things they absolutely love, and how can I reduce some of the things they avoid. And in doing all of this, we want to be creative. There are going to be some things that your church has always done that you've got to kind of throw out the window or adapt a little bit. But why not? That's love, isn't it? We're putting people above programs. And also putting people above places. So one family told me that they used to go to a church that had a really echoey kids space, and their child had social difficulties, but also sensory difficulties. So imagine an echoey kids space where they're all noisy. And so this family went to the church and suggested perhaps they could put up some sound-absorbing boards on a wall. Great idea, right? The family was going to pay for it, install it, make it work. But unfortunately, the church said that the trouble with that is it makes that wall quite ugly, and the staff team needs to meet in that room every week, and so they're not going to put up those. And so ultimately this child wasn't able to come along to the kids' church, and the family ended up leaving that church. Now, of course, there are times where a family might ask for something that they need that actually isn't possible. They need all the lights off, perhaps. That might not be possible. But it's this attitude of being willing to talk it through. Okay, well, that's not going to work for these reasons. I wonder what can work. What else could we do? How could we adapt? How could we work together? Tell me more about why that's hard. It's these conversations. And I think this is also why there's not a checklist of 50 things your church needs to do in order to support neurodivergent people. I hope that list never exists, because if there is, it's taken out all of this being curious, being collaborative. It's taken out all of the being creative with the family. Instead, we're doing it in collaboration with people. But of course, being creative can also be preparing to support people who haven't yet stepped foot in your building, or who haven't even said that they need supports. So working out, some people will find this or that quite challenging, quite difficult. Some people don't want to come in through the one and only church door that's open where you have to walk past 3 people and say welcome. And just having a second option, just quietly on the side. Who knows if anyone's even going to need it, but perhaps they will. Or today, the slides, these are dyslexia-friendly slides. I don't know if there's anyone here who's going to benefit from that, but it didn't take me much effort to work out how to make slides that are going to support people better if they do have those additional needs. Simple. There are so many things like this that we can be doing in churches. And all of this, of course, is because we want to love like Christ. So it just keeps coming back to loving like Christ doesn't mean loving our building most, our programs most, name tags or whatever it might be most. Being prepared to say, this doesn't work for you, let's work out how we can do it. I want to love you. A church that loves like Christ, as Tony was saying, is a church that works together, a church that bears each other's burdens, a church that's supportive, a church where everyone can belong in Christ. So we've done really well for timing, Tony. Before we go to questions, though, I just want to, what do I aim? This is my podcast. So this was born out of a lot of, I do also do some writing, which I'll get to, but a lot of people told me I don't have time to read. And so I run this podcast with Dave Whittingham, who's an autistic man. He's a Christian. He's worked in education and ministry. And together we're just trying to work out what this can look like for families and churches. I encourage you to have a listen to episode 6, where we have someone on she's a Christian lecturer in psychology, and she's done a lot of work into how to make churches easier for people who are autistic. So I really encourage you to listen to episode 6. There's a follow-up episode, episode 7, about looking after neurodivergent families and individuals. That can be found anywhere you listen to your podcasts, or you can Google it. And then QR code for this one. I write resources for families and for churches. I really encourage you to have a read. There are some in there specifically for churches. There's a series of 3 for churches, and I'd encourage you to have a read of that. You can subscribe, and that way you then get notified when there's a new one coming out. I'd also really encourage you, if you're a podcast listener, I really hope so, the Centre for Christian Living has 3 episodes on neurodivergence, and they are an excellent resource. So if you can look up Centre for Christian Living, and I think they're called Neurodivergence and the Christian Life. Okay, yep, go for them. Yeah, I really encourage that. All right, we have some time for questions.